Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here. And today I've got a very interesting guest with me. This is Bastian Purrer. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is the founder of humanID, which I think is just a very interesting company that is out there right now. And I wanted to have him on, obviously due to the situation in Ukraine, but we have more global issues than Ukraine, especially when it comes to identities online. And so we're going to go dive into this. And so Bastian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Nick, for having me on. And it's always a pleasure to talk to you. So I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Great, great. Yeah, me too, me too. Now, first things first, just for the audience, can you explain exactly what humanID is?
Yeah, so humanID is a nonprofit and open source replacement of tools like the login with Facebook or the login with Google called single sign-ons. So we allow users or people to sign on to websites or tools or applications in a way that on one hand is completely anonymous. So no private data is shared with the app you're logging into or even saved with us. And on the other hand, it helps websites and applications to block bots, spam, and other accounts. So therefore enabling them to build healthier and better communities.
Right, right. And I think that's such an important thing because we have a huge problem with spam accounts, with bots. You know, literally today, I just on LinkedIn had somebody that connected to me that said they were in marketing research for Dior, the big perfume company, I think out of Paris. And they immediately went into right after that, as I said, thanks for connecting, like, hey, sexy, you know, like, and I'm like, oh my, like, okay, really? And they called my state, Illinois, a beautiful and prosperous land, which, I mean, come on. So yeah, we have a huge problem with this. We really, really do. And so let's talk about social media, because I think that's one of those big things where we have issues with this, you know, on the bot and spam side, as well as the privacy side as well, because we all know they're data mining. But many platforms, especially on social media, really try to make it as easy as possible for anyone to sign up. So basically, I can sign up for as many Facebook accounts as I want. They're also not enforcing advanced security, things like multi-factor authentication right out of the gate. The user has to find themselves, find MFA, multi-factor authentication themselves. So what do you think is the biggest issue the world has with the Facebooks and in terms of this kind of methodology? How can we improve it?
Yeah, I think the biggest part is really the fact that anyone can create as many accounts as they want. And if you get blocked by someone, for example, probably the person on LinkedIn, you probably blocked them, right? After they complimented you and your state. But right immediately afterwards, that person or that automated computer program can just create another account on LinkedIn and do the same thing to you again. And that lacks something like that, just lacks accountability. At humanID, we were thinking a lot about like, how does the offline world work? How do functioning societies work outside the internet? And specifically, how do elections and democracy work? In elections, we take it for granted that everyone's voice is protected and anonymous, that the government or anyone else does not have an excuse to figure out who we voted for. Absolutely no excuse, it's completely protected. But also we take for granted that everyone only gets to vote once. And so everyone has one voice, but only one voice. Mm-hmm. And both of these factors are incredibly important for democracy to work. And we believe the same is true for any functioning community, like for the online community. If everyone only had one voice, but that voice was truly protected and anonymous at will, right? Like if you want to say who you are, that's totally fine too. Then just communities would function a lot better. And that's also how humanID actually started. Maybe I can tell a little bit about the founding story. So I lived for many years in Indonesia, which is in Southeast Asia, the third biggest democracy in the world, 260 million people. And they had elections around 3 years ago. They were very contested, pretty comparable to the American elections. And in the run up to that, I did marketing, and one of the parties approached me to help them with their marketing. And I wanted them to win, generally. So I tried to help them, and I realized that all the different parties were using these massive bot networks and spam accounts, often semi-automated, like one person on a computer just in charge of hundreds of accounts to spread certain material that helps them. And oftentimes that is fake news, that is slanderous material, rumors, fake election results, things like that. Mm-hmm. And the results were on one hand, like similar to the American society, like polarization, hateful rumors, bubble thinking, but also like the election results were not trusted by half the population. People went to the Capitol to riot after the elections. That was a year before the American election, so it was sort of a look into the future.
In 2016?
In 2019.
In 2019, okay.
So like the American elections had 2016 issues. They had 2020 issues. It's the same in my home country of Germany. It's a global problem. It's not one politician that's the problem, because every other country has politicians like that too, polarizing. That's just what's being amplified by how our networks work, our social networks work.
Gotcha. So in that vein, I mean, it seems like the world is ripe for, like you said, one voice, one ID in that sense. It keeps elections fair and honest. Do you think, just on a quick tangent, in terms of that election that you had experience with in Indonesia, and obviously, the US election as well as German elections, all that kind of stuff, do you think that the world is basically behind on election laws, meaning countries are not really taking into account modern technology that would allow a political party to create thousands of fake accounts to essentially try to flood the zone, meaning go viral with whatever information that they want? Doesn't seem to be standards and practices there. What do you think about that?
So maybe a little bit what I was saying was a little bit confusing. Like the election itself, oftentimes the last thing that works. Like everyone only gets to vote once, but in the run to the elections, all kinds of like where people get their information from, how they discuss it, how they find the context to news, if it's really true or not. That is what is broken. I think legislation could help. Of course, I mean, Google, Facebook, and so on have massive market power, and maybe therefore not the right incentives to really change and build better communities. I think there's also a big topic that's probably a whole hours of discussion separately, maybe, of like a platform like TikTok, where a foreign government has direct access to the servers whenever they want, having so much screen time with especially every young person in America. That is a security issue by itself. But I think the topic, more on the topic what we're talking about, is Facebook and the other social networks don't have the incentive to get this right. On one hand, because of their profit model. On one hand, like if identity is your product, you never have an incentive to limit your product, how much you sell of your product. So if I want to buy 10 of your user accounts, you're going to give me those because each of them counts as a monthly active user in my quarterly reports. And so Facebook has an incentive to not be too strict on additional accounts, because they want to report a lot of monthly active users. And reports and studies show that 30 to 50% of their supposedly 2.8 billion or whatever the latest number is, user accounts is not genuine and is fake. That's crazy. And they officially said, and in their transparency report, in quotation marks here, they say that they deleted billions, around I think 15 billion in the last 2 years, some crazy number like this, like a multitude of their accounts that they leave on of bot accounts. So they admit they're deleting a lot, but they're not deleting enough because they have the wrong incentive. On the other hand, and that's something that's more commonly known, I think they clearly don't have an incentive to give us true privacy because they make money off our data. So humanID that's why we're a nonprofit, because on one hand, that way we can really truly promise, yes, we keep this open source, here's the code, you can see that we don't save anything, and we really committed to this goal of everyone gets ideally only one account.
Right. And I've done videos and I've talked about it on my radio show before, just that huge problem. I mean, if I'm looking at my own team, if we are looking at doing a network assessment, or we are hired to, phish and all of that, we will set up fake Facebook accounts and nobody's really stopping us. And I think that is a huge thing. And so my question then I guess becomes, if social media platforms were to enforce humanID right out of the gate, 100%. In other words, if you were signing up for Facebook, you had to have humanID. How would that change or possibly improve or worsen a user's experience?
I mean, on day one, Facebook's market value would plummet because they would suddenly have much less monthly active users.
Can we install humanID right now then?
I mean, they had quite some damage last month, so things are moving in the right direction, maybe. But like beyond that, after that, I think accountability just leads. First of all, you would have all these bots gone. So if you go on any like I don't know, like political candidates comment section, you will see massive amounts of obvious bots, but they're getting better. And there's a lot of studies that show that everyone thinks that they are the ones that can spot bots and can spot fake news. But the truth is we all cannot. We are all falling for it. And actually, the more educated people are, the more likely they are to fall for it. There's some really interesting studies there.
Yes.
But those would be gone. So there would be more a fair discussion, just like we have them among friends. Like those discussions tend to be much higher quality, much more informative, and open and tolerant than those that we see online. And then there would, I think, over a longer time, there would be more of a sense of accountability. Like if I know I can get blocked and then it will actually be blocked and cannot come back, just like in the real world, right? If I'm a dick to you, you're not going to talk to me anymore forever. I cannot just like copy paste and let's try again.
Right.
And I'm not saying that's the only reason I'm friendly to you, but it does lead to certain like accountability, why we be like that we behave like good to our friends and everyone else, and don't run on the streets screaming. And I think it's similar, like the online behavior of people would match more of how they behave in the real world. And as I've read great reports are like where they try to meet these trolls, and people are really hateful online, and they met them in real life, and these were like really normal people, like doctors and teachers that just had this like parallel life.
Yeah, yeah, and it seems like a lot of people, and I've seen similar studies, to that as well, where one, as you mentioned, we fall for fake news all the time. I think it was a Pew study that had something like 30 different conspiracy theories and said, do you believe this? Do you not believe this? Do you somewhat believe this? And there were a lot of people that actually believe these things because they seem almost logical and they seem almost real. And conversely on that, as we are talking about it, it seems like there are a lot of people that, I don't know, they have a bad day and they don't want to take it out on anybody else. So they go online and just say these awful and hateful things. But essentially what you're saying, though, is because humanID offers essentially a certain level of anonymity, but you're also a unique identity, you now have the impetus to be more polite, just be cooler online, if you will. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, people like to blame anonymity for the problem online, but I'm actually old enough to remember like the first online chats, like 1999 or something like this. People were pretty friendly, and we did not have the problems we have right now, but everyone was anonymous. There was a famous joke about you don't know if you talk to a dog on the other end. So anonymity is really not the problem. And a lot of anonymous community also show that. The problem is lack of accountability.
Gotcha. Well, and I mean, maybe the whole thing starts with America. Because I'm assuming in 1999 you were in Germany, right?
I was, so it probably was 3 years earlier over there.
So there was a famous case here in the United States called AOL v. Zaran, or Zaran v. AOL, where essentially somebody accused another AOL member of basically, I think it was like a war crime or a crime or something like that. And essentially that person ended up being harassed severely. And that's where the US government came up with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to essentially address that, meaning AOL, Facebook, et cetera, are not publishers. They are simply platforms, and you can say what you want, but they have been absolved of liability. And that's obviously something we are now once again revisiting and debating, given everything that we've got here. Now, I want to go back to Facebook real quick, because something that I've talked about in the past with Facebook is essentially Facebook has actually allowed war crimes to occur in Facebook groups. Now, this is prior to the war that we're seeing in Ukraine, and we're going to get to that in a second here. But there have been Facebook groups, for example, that have been created in the Middle East to traffic stolen historical artifacts. That is a war crime, because you're removing that from that culture and selling it elsewhere into places like Iraq. Now, Facebook basically doesn't have enough translators. They don't understand, as these people are communicating in Arabic or Farsi or any of those languages. And so what would a human ID look like in that situation? Because obviously you're giving somebody total anonymity, but at the same token, they have a unique ID. So what would that look like in terms of this particular problem?
So the easy answer would be Facebook could block it, this specific user account, and they could not just easily come back and try again. But also Facebook could not identify the person. And I do think as society, we have to make a decision. If we want to be able to track every click back to the physical person, human behind it, then we will be able to do that for everything, including every expression of opinion. Or if we are fine with some things not be traceable with encryption, basically, and then sometimes we have to find other ways to arrest criminals. And
Right.
I'm clearly on the second part, obviously, on the second side here. I think not everything that is done by a expression of words should be able to be traced back. It's either everything or nothing, or not everything, or there's holes. And if we know that if we undermine encryption, and if we don't make that possible, that authoritarian regimes will eventually abuse it and will know every single click we do and every word we type, even if we don't send it sometimes. Yeah. And we can never know if our governments will always stay free. There might be one bad guy, or it might go down. Like, we shouldn't build the systems assuming that our political systems is always stable, and we should be aware that we're also building the tools that people in authoritarian regimes will use. So yeah.
Well, and that's literally what you're talking about is my fourth TED Talk, which was about the privacy concerns in Afghanistan, because they had a free and open democracy for 20 years that was enforced by essentially the US military and government. And when the United States pulled out, the Taliban obviously came in. This is a very oppressive and brutal regime. But what was left behind were a whole bunch of German machines by a company called Dermalog, where they were taking the biometrics, fingerprints and face IDs essentially of citizens so that it was one person, one vote. But they were also cataloging those people that were helping the US military and government infrastructure, such as translators or families and all of that. And now this all gets turned over to the Taliban. And here we are. They've got a roadmap into exactly who is against them and exactly who they need to execute. So the point of shifting regime change, I mean, and we're literally seeing this in Ukraine right now, potentially as they are fighting for their lives against a Russian invasion. That is a very excellent point. And this is something that I think goes back years. We had here in the United States the San Bernardino shooter. Apple famously refused to unlock essentially their iPhone, because if they were to break their encryption for one, they would break it for all. And by virtue of that, they didn't want to do that, because overwhelmingly, we're not terrorists. We're not committing war crimes. We're not shooting people. And so why should our privacy be ruined? And I think that is one of those debates that is very, very central to, to this issue, which is, I think, where humanID is really wading in here, in that sense, trying to find that balance. At least that's where I see humanID is, and full disclosure to my audience too, I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning. I am a strategic advisor for humanID, because I believe in the technology. So this isn't necessarily a sales pitch for humanID. It's a nonprofit. I just think it's an interesting discussion to have, especially in the light of Ukraine. And let's turn to that situation in a moment, because I've been interviewing members of their parliament and other government officials for the past week or so. And the one that I mentioned, the one that I interviewed Friday, March 4th in the morning, basically said that they were witnessing a massive disinformation campaign that Russia is sending their way. In fact, an Italian publication recently just exploded on Twitter when they published basically the statement that said that President Zelensky, who has famously said he's not going to leave Kyiv, he doesn't want to ride, he wants ammunition, was actually taken to Poland for his safety, which is not true. And the source that the Italians were using was Russian media. And so I've seen other reports where somebody in Ukraine that has their mother is in Russia, their mother does not believe they're being bombed right now because of what the Russian media, what Russian internet is telling the Russian people. And so as we are looking at this, where would a humanID fit in terms of helping Ukraine, as they are obviously fighting for their lives right now?
So, I mean, a lot of people in America have read and heard a lot about what happened in 2016 with the whole bot networks and so on, spreading fake news about the election, undermining the elections. The truth is, this hasn't stopped. Like it's less, it's not everywhere anymore every day on the American media. Facebook has focused a lot on cleaning up sort of the American market, but they don't do it for the same reason that you mentioned earlier about languages and so on, but most of all because it's just not as much PR. They're not as careful in other countries. So Russia uses the same kind of strategies everywhere, including in the Ukraine for many years. And I mean, they have been occupying parts of Ukraine since 2014, and I'm sure they're running these kind of disinformation campaigns there since at least that long. I know they have been trying to influence the German elections, and I think they were successful in my opinion, but that's hard to prove. I've seen these kind of efforts in 2019 in the Indonesian elections. I know that there's American marketing firms, American companies that offer bot network services as a usual part on both the left and the right. So it has become a really common part of misinformation campaign. So when Russians today, or like if some people, let's say, like, and like includes part of my family as well, actually, believe in these things that Putin is saying, it's not because they read something today. It's because of over years and years, these kind of things were sent their way via upvotes on their Facebook feeds. Mm-hmm. Of course, it's not just the bots. It's also Russian investment in RT and Sputnik and these things, censorship of Russian media, buying foreign officials. The former chancellor of Germany is literally a bot stooge of the Kremlin. Like he's on the board of their gas company until today. He has not condemned the Russian aggression until today.
He's on the board of Rosneft or Gazprom.
I think both, or like one he was and then moved to the other.
I did not know that. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, he was the predecessor of Angela Merkel. Mm-hmm. He was German chancellor from 98 until 2005, 7 years. And he's until today Putin's best friend.
Is that Helmut Kohl?
No, that's before that, between Kohl and Merkel.
Okay.
He's in the same party as the current chancellor and the current president of Germany. And the same is true for the former French Prime Minister, François Fillon. So this is like, he's literally buying politicians. And so there's a lot of efforts. Long story short, if humanID was implemented in every bigger social media network, there would be a lot less of the bot networks that put a lot that really manipulate the algorithm. But it's not everything that social networks can do. Of course, there's other things like making it much easier to find context for news. Like right now, people are expected to like media literacies. People are expected to go on Google and search for 30 minutes for every link they're reading or every fact that they're seeing. Nobody has the time to do that. You can't expect people to do that. Facebook should immediately show the context. Okay, what has this domain brought up in the past? What do other media outlets say about this? What do journalists and fact checkers say about this? But they don't do that because it doesn't get as much engagement as it does when they just show what people want to hear and want to see in the moment.
Right. And I mean, I think that's a really important point. Like we here in the United States, obviously if we go to Facebook, now, especially with COVID-19 information, it'll give you a link, or I've seen people post something where Facebook says this is misinformation. And obviously, to your point, it's death by 1,000 information cuts, where you are essentially subjected to this information that confirms your bias. And now you're seeing stuff that's a little more out there, a little more out there, a little more out there, but it's still in that vein. And so by virtue of that, it's, like I said, it's not a 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. It takes time to do this. I'm also wondering though, because we have a lot of Ukrainian infrastructure, internet infrastructure that's still up, meaning I've had 2 solid interviews with members of parliament and different locations, in the country, mostly around Kyiv, and their internet is up. And a lot of reports are saying that essentially the Russians are intentionally not taking out the internet because they need to use the internet as well. That's obviously a double-edged sword in the sense that as the Russians are using that for their military or whatever purposes, information delivery or disinformation delivery, the Ukrainians are also using it and seeing this as well. My concern here is that if Ukrainians right now are going on to, Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media they're using and essentially saying death to Russia or, whatever it is, if Russia takes that over, now they potentially have access to this information, meaning, oh, like, Nick is in Ukraine and he's saying death to, death to Russia. Well, great. Now Nick is considered an enemy of the state, and, they'll arrest me or whatever. Can human ID in some way, shape, or form help with that? As we are, logging into things.
In a limited degree. I mean, obviously, we cannot really take over Twitter or Facebook at this point. I also don't think, Twitter or Facebook will not give the specific user data or location of people directly to the Kremlin. There's ways to collect that, to buy that data. There have been popular apps that don't really know, like the data market is just so hard to understand, and like everyone sells these billions of account data left and right, that it's totally possible that Russia bought some of this information and tries to identify people that way. Human ID could help by, and we are working with whistleblowing sites specifically at this point, where people can report, for example, like things they're seeing, right now our use cases are mostly around employer based, so people that want to report the employer or an harassment that happened or something like this. And we're also working, our integration client works with the Department of Justice there, and so around to drug and arm crimes. Things like this could be helpful potentially for people in the Ukraine, especially if things get worse, and there's like underground movements or something like this. We do hope that in the future, for future conflicts, that social media sites that are using human ID are getting bigger and growing, so that they can actually be a significant force there, by letting people create accounts completely anonymously. So even if the site gets hacked and leaks their whole user database, which happens, then there would be no personal identifiable information in that data. We don't save any personal identifiable information either. So even in the worst case scenario that even happened to the CIA and Facebook and so on,
right,
people couldn't be identified. Unfortunately, we are currently not in that position yet. We are looking for any online community that wants to protect their users more, that wants to protect themselves more from potential leaks, would be good to check out human ID.
Great. And one of the, I think probably one of the last questions I have for you is, it is looking like in Ukraine that at some point we are expecting a massive surge in terms of Russian attacks, meaning it is looking like they can potentially take Kyiv, they can potentially take Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, Odessa, which is a large port city, and all of these. If essentially that happens, the Ukrainian people have essentially vowed to fight on. They're going to create an insurgency, and NATO is supplying them with weapons to this effect, so that they can continue to fight the Russians, even if their capital falls, even if President Zelensky is killed or captured. In that sense, when you are looking at coordination between dissidents essentially using the internet, how could human ID help in that? Because it's anonymous, obviously it's going to help protect, but what would you envision an insurgency, and would you reach out to the insurgents as human ID to basically say, hey, leverage our products in whatever platform you're communicating with to make yourself anonymous? Like what does that look like for you? What are your thoughts on that?
So we are actually, for the last 2 years, have been in close contact to a group of activists in Southeast Asia. I don't know if you heard of the Milk Tea Alliance, but those are activists across young activists across Asian countries that have stood up against, of course, in Hong Kong, but also the regimes in Thailand and other places around the region. And we are planning to build together with them a communication app where people can communicate and organize. We are lacking the funds for that at this point, to be very frank. We are all volunteer driven right now, so that's a massive project. But our login can be implemented very easily and is ready to use in any existing services that are looking for more protection. In the meantime, Signal is a fellow nonprofit that I would always trust more. I know in Ukraine, Telegram is really widespread because it's from the region basically, but cannot really be trusted for everything that researchers, and curious if you have an opinion on that.
Yes.
But because of its ownership structure and connection to the Russian state, people should be very careful with. But yeah.
Right. Well, and it's the same with WhatsApp as well. So some of the individuals I've been speaking with, and I mean, I've never used WhatsApp until this past week. You know, it's a Facebook-owned product, and I know it's incredibly popular around the globe, but like Telegram, it has its privacy issues. And Russia famously basically gave Telegram an ultimatum: either you're going to weaken your encryption for us in Russia, or you're not going to be used in Russia. And, you know, here we are, it's being used in Russia. So obviously there are concerns with that as well, you know, from an infrastructure and identification standpoint. But it's a huge thing. And with that, I mean, thank you for your time. I mean, this is I think been really interesting, you know, and I think it's just such an important topic to talk about, because as we are attempting to protect the Ukrainians as best we can from outside their borders, leveraging every available option. It's not just weapons that they need, it's the ability to move freely online without having the Russians, you know, identify them as they are trying to coordinate actions for a possible insurgency. So Bastian, thank you so much. If people want to know more about you or humanID, where can they go? What can they follow?
So they can go to human-internet.org. humanID is part of the Foundation for Human Internet that has actually been established right now this month. So check it out, and you can try the login right there on the website. And if you look on GitHub, you can find our code. Again, we're fully transparent, fully nonprofit, and appreciate any support we can get.
That's great. So that's human-id.org.
It's it's either that or it's human-internet.org.
Gotcha. And with that, Bastian Purrer, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.